So, when World War II finally comes to an end, justice for the leaders of the Axis powers is pretty swift and honestly pretty severe. But there was one man, the supreme leader of Imperial Japan, who was treated completely differently. His fate is still one of the most fascinating and controversial decisions in modern history, and we're going to dig into why.
I mean, it's a huge paradox, right? In Europe, leaders were put on trial, they were executed, or they took their own lives. So why was Emperor Hirohito, the man in whose name millions of people fought and died, allowed to just stay on the throne? That is the big question we're tackling here.
And you can really see the difference right here. On one side, you've got the fate of the European Axis leaders: trials, death, condemnation. On the other side, Emperor Hirohito not only dodges any kind of prosecution, he goes on to reign for another 4 decades and eventually becomes a symbol for a totally new Japan. To get how this could have possibly happened, we first have to understand who he was before everything fell apart.
Yeah. See, before 1945, Emperor Hirohito wasn't just some political leader or a king. He was seen as something much, much more.
Think about this for a second. He was the 124th emperor of Japan. He was the head of a dynasty that's believed to be the oldest continuous monarchy in the entire world. That number alone carries this immense weight of history and tradition, a kind of divine link his people had revered for centuries.
And that gets us to this key concept of Arhitogami. This wasn't just a fancy title, it was a deeply held genuine belief. Hirohito was considered a living god on earth, a direct descendant of the sun goddess herself. This divine status was pretty much the foundation of Japanese society, and it gave the military leaders who waged war in his name an almost untouchable authority.
So you've got this strange split, right? For most Japanese people, he was this distant, almost mythical figure. Most of them had never even heard his actual voice. But for the rest of the world, he was the face of an empire that had carved a brutal, bloody path all across Asia and the Pacific. It's this double identity that really sets the stage for the incredibly dramatic end of the war.
By the summer of 1945, the Empire of Japan was standing right on the edge of total collapse. This led to a chain of events that would force the living god to do something nobody ever thought possible.
I mean, just look at how fast everything fell apart. On August 6th, Hiroshima is devastated by this terrifying new weapon. Just 3 days later, Nagasaki gets hit with the same thing. And on that exact same day, the Soviet Union declares war and starts pouring troops into Manchuria. In just 72 hours, Japan's situation went from dire to completely, utterly hopeless. They were backed into a corner.
And yet, even after all that unimaginable horror, the government was deadlocked. The military hardliners were getting ready for a national suicide mission, planning to arm civilians, men, women, and kids, with bamboo spears if they had to. They would have rather seen the whole nation destroyed than surrender.
It was right then, in that moment, that Hirohito did something that had never been done before. He shattered centuries of imperial tradition and intervened directly. He called his ministers together and, in his own words, told them they had to accept surrender. He used this now famous phrase, asking his people to accept the unacceptable, all for the sake of the nation's survival.
But the drama wasn't over, not by a long shot. In a final, desperate move, a group of military officers actually staged a coup. They stormed the imperial palace, and they were hunting for one thing: the record of the emperor's speech. Their goal was to destroy it before it could be broadcast and just keep the war going. It's wild. But they failed. The next day, for the first time in history, the people of Japan heard the voice of their emperor. The war was over. So with Japan defeated, the head of the Allied occupation, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, arrives. And now he has this monumental question staring him in the face. What do you do with the emperor?
Now, for a lot of people around the world, the answer seemed pretty obvious. Arrest him. Try him as a war criminal right alongside his generals. But MacArthur was on the ground in Japan, and he saw that the situation was way more complicated than that.
MacArthur's choice, when you lay it out, was stark. Prosecuting the emperor, who remember was still seen as a god by millions, could ignite a massive, bloody insurgency. It could mean a long and terrible occupation. But preserving him, well, that offered a powerful alternative. He could be used as a symbol of stability, as a tool to get millions of soldiers to peacefully lay down their arms, and as a bridge between old Japan and a new, democratic one. MacArthur chose pragmatism over punishment.
This decision meant that Hirohito had to be completely reinvented. The man who was a god had to become just a man, a symbol for a nation that was being rebuilt from absolute rubble.
And this all led to one pivotal, incredible moment. In his New Year's address in 1946, Hirohito did the unthinkable. He publicly announced that he was not a god. He declared that the ties between him and his people were not based on mere legends and myths. With just those few words, a core belief that had stood for more than 2,000 years just disappeared.
A new constitution, which was mostly written under American supervision, stripped the emperor of all political power. He was no longer a living god or a sovereign ruler. He was now a constitutional monarch, a figurehead whose only job was to be a symbol of the state and the unity of the people.
And his public image was carefully remade. He started touring the country in a simple suit, visiting factories, shaking hands with everyday people, things that would have been completely unthinkable just a year earlier. And privately, he got to really dig into his lifelong passion for marine biology, becoming a published scholar in the field. It was this quiet, humanizing detail for a man once seen as divine.
But despite this really remarkable transformation, the decision to spare Hirohito has left behind a complex and deeply unresolved legacy that historians are still arguing about to this very day.
And the debate really boils down to these two conflicting views. Was he a powerless puppet, a prisoner in his own palace who was just manipulated by a military clique that held all the real power? Or was he fully aware and an active participant, who sanctioned the war and was complicit in all its horrors? The truth, as it usually does, probably lies somewhere in the middle.
But you know what isn't up for debate? The outcome. While his top generals and ministers faced the gallows for war crimes, Hirohito, the man in whose name they did everything, was never even called to testify. He was completely shielded from any kind of prosecution.
He would go on to reign for 44 more years, dying in 1989 as the longest reigning monarch in his nation's history. His life really spanned Japan's most chaotic century, its rise as an imperial power, its total devastation, and its unbelievable rebirth as an economic giant and a peaceful democracy.
And so, we're left with this final, nagging question. Was the decision to spare him a necessary evil? A pragmatic choice that prevented more bloodshed and helped create the stable, democratic Japan we know today? Or was it a cynical deal that let a man with the ultimate responsibility just walk away from it all? The answer continues to shape how we understand the end of the war and, really, the beginning of the modern world.